In this episode, we're looking at Taiwan's economic miracle. And don't worry, we're talking economics, but it's really going to be very interesting, I promise. So Taiwan in the 1950s was, it's fair to say, an economic basket case. It had a huge military budget, but was still recovering from World War II bombing and from those horrific years right after World War II when the country was essentially stripped of resources for the Civil War. And then, following the Civil War, there was an influx of more than 1 million refugees. We're talking terrible poverty, people living in shacks, kids going to school barefoot, shortages of food, shortages of pretty much everything. And yet, this poor agricultural backwater would, within a generation, have transformed into a manufacturing powerhouse, and by the turn of the century, a rich, developed nation at the forefront of the computer age. And that's what we call the Taiwanese economic miracle.
The Taiwan History Podcast, Formosa Files, is made possible through the generous sponsorship of the Frank C. Chen Foundation.
Formosa Files.
Sometimes you'll see the phrase economic miracle in quote marks and commentary to the effect that there was nothing special about the rapid growth. It's just a matter of applying inputs, increase the capital and labor, and you get growth.
Okay, so in your opinion, does it deserve to be called an economic miracle?
Well, it wasn't water into wine miraculous.
Okay.
But yes, truly remarkable. It's not unique. Post-war Germany and Japan and a few other places had similar decades of high growth, but it is really special. Unlike those successes, Taiwan had not been a manufacturing nation.
Right.
There was that military burden and many other things. For example, they have a new language to learn, Mandarin.
True. I hadn't thought of that. Like, imagine if the Germans after World War II had to rebuild their country while everyone's speaking French, or perhaps the Japanese having to use the Korean language.
Yes. And Taiwan's success was not just the low-hanging fruit of urbanization, moving people from farms to factories, having families just go up from a bicycle to a scooter. Taiwan broke through the so-called middle-income trap.
Yeah, and that's not easy, as countries like Brazil or perhaps Thailand and others know. So when does this miracle begin?
Well, for economic growth, we could go back to the 50s or around 1962. The decade after that averaged 10.8% growth. But that's growth from a very low base. Let's take it from 1965, which is the last year of U.S. economic aid. From 1951 through to 1965, Taiwan had relied on American aid.
And we're talking about an economy in Taiwan that's largely agricultural at the time, not much manufacturing.
Mm-hmm. Early recovery and growth is built on agriculture. There's a wonderful land reform program, a subject which deserves its own episode, so we don't really have time to get into that.
Okay, we don't have time, but it is a super important thing. So let's just give people the basics. At the end of Japanese rule, most people in Taiwan were farmers, and the majority of them were tenant farmers, which means they didn't own the land that they worked, and usually they paid very high rents. Land reform gave public land to these farmers, and also, using American aid money, bought private land and redistributed this. The end result was that the great majority of farmers now owned farms, and those who were still tenants had their rents reduced. Quite impressive.
It was cleverly done, putting capital into the system without creating inflation. And it was hyperinflation which had finished off the nationalists in mainland China as much as Mao's guerrillas.
Right. But of course, financial history is complicated and comparatively dull, so it doesn't get central billing most of the time.
In the 1950s, trade with Japan resumed, links cut after the war, reestablished, and Japan is a big and growing market. Most Taiwan exports are farm produce, and the exports are going to Japan. That old economic star from throughout the centuries. Sugar, what else?
Okay, what else would be bananas? It's funny, but you know, a lot of older Japanese people have this very clear association with Taiwan and bananas. They think of Taiwan, they think of bananas. And actually, we have a war wharf in Kaohsiung. It's called, I believe, Banana Pier. And it's the spot where back in the 50s and 60s, that's where they brought the bananas to be loaded onto the boat. So they've got like a little museum down there. You can go see the old pictures of just crates and crates of bananas. And yeah, Taiwan was a banana republic.
I like that. There was a lot of canned fruit and vegetables sold too. Canned mushrooms, canned asparagus, canned pineapple. And farmers are getting richer, well, comparatively richer, and some want to start small factories.
Right. The manufacturing in the early days is not for export. This is daily necessities for the local population. And the government wanted as few imports as possible, which makes sense. And they're pushing import substitution, and it's a very protected market.
Yes, import substitution by government-run businesses and small private businesses. And then in the 1960s, the economy will switch to an export focus. Remember that last year of US aid?
1965.
Yeah. It's also the first year that the United States puts troops on the ground in Vietnam. The war quickly escalates there, and you'll soon have 500,000 men.
And as horrific as that war was for not only Vietnam, but the world, it was a huge boost for Taiwan. There were Air Force bases here in Taiwan bombing Vietnam. Can you imagine, all the way from Taichung and Tainan flying over there? And of course, the soldiers that were here on Taiwan were spending money. And in Vietnam, the soldiers are eating canned food and using other supplies made in Taiwan.
And the war gives a boost for East Asian exports to the US itself. Ships bringing supplies and equipment from the US to Vietnam are empty on the homeward leg. And that means basically free transport costs for goods going back to America.
Interesting. Another thing I hadn't thought of. Okay, so ships are bringing over stuff for the troops and then going back, and there's space. So why not carry something with them? But also, transport costs in general are going down dramatically right about this time. Distance is becoming a much smaller cost factor because of the introduction of container shipping. And my little city here of Kaohsiung had the country's first container terminal that opened in 1970.
Another thing happening is the Japanese economic miracle that's spilling over into Taiwan. Japan is probably the untold story of how Taiwan transitioned from agriculture to industry.
And Taiwanese still would commonly, at that time, speak Japanese. Maybe not the younger factory workers, but the managers and senior engineers.
At the start of our economic miracle in Taiwan, a textile factory worker earned $20 to $25 a month, roughly a third of the labor cost in Japan.
Right. So it makes total sense to have branch factories in a former colony that has many people who speak your language as well.
Yes, many companies did set up branches. Familiar names like Panasonic, Hitachi, Casio, and they outsourced work to Taiwanese companies, provided machinery and training. And in the late 1960s, Taiwan was the largest recipient of Japanese foreign investment. And a lot of trends are coming together at that time. We see the rise of discount chains, Kmart, Walmart, Target. Kmart opened a buying office in Taipei in 1971, and get this, by 1992, Taiwan accounted for 40% of all its imports.
40%. That's a huge proportion. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about like the heart of Taiwan's growth. Contract manufacturers in Taiwan, typically small, medium-sized Taiwanese companies, supplying retailers in the US. And they're making, just about everything. Christmas tree lights, curtains, clocks, bicycles, sports shoes, umbrellas, guitars, toys. And one particular toy would be the Barbie doll. And when I asked you before we started recording, John, about products that would encapsulate those miracle years, you said...
Yeah, we weren't talking about Barbie dolls.
You said the Barbie doll story was a good match for this economic miracle time.
Yes, well, you be the judge. Here are the basic facts. 1967, in the Taishan district, in what is now New Taipei City, about 7 kilometers from Taipei main station, as the crow flies, but semi-rural in the 60s. Taishan was home to the flagship factory producing Barbie dolls for the world. Mattel, the company making Barbie, built its first overseas factory, and it was a joint venture with a local plastics manufacturer. The factory opened with 20 workers, and they ended up with 8,000 at its peak in the early 1980s. It produced about 50,000 Barbies a day. That's many millions a year.
8,000 workers and 50,000 Barbies a day. Amazing.
The factory was so busy, though, some work needed to be contracted out to workers outside of the factory. Thousands of housewives took up the piecework jobs. They were sewing buttons and lace, putting shoes on the Barbie dolls. Then in 1987, the factory moved its operations from Taiwan, looking for cheaper labor.
So they moved to China?
To Indonesia and China, I believe. So what do you think? Barbie's a good example?
I like the local outsourcing aspect. It does fit. So subcontracting to small factories and homes was a huge thing at that time in Taiwan. In homes all around Taiwan, you'd find rooms full of various products, dolls possibly, or Christmas decorations, plastic flowers, you name it. The government had this slogan translated to English as living rooms as factories, Chinese something like 客厅及工厂. They wanted to increase married women's labor force participation. So factories employed young women, but then after they got married and had a kid, they dropped out of the workforce. So factories at home was a good way of keeping them employed. And the Barbie story is also a pretty good example in terms of timing. So 1965 to 1987, roughly some 2 decades of labor-intensive manufacturing, and then the factories start leaving for cheaper labor.
There's a good example from Kaohsiung, where you live, of a major Taiwan industry which was also the victim of rising wages and a few other things. Ship scrapping.
Ship scrapping, also known as ship breaking. That's the work of taking ships apart for scrap metal. And indeed, Kaohsiung was the world's graveyard for old ships. Much of the metal was used in the construction that was taking place across Taiwan at that time. So through the 1970s to around 1988, Kaohsiung made Taiwan the #1 ship breaker in the world, and it was that for something like 18 consecutive years.
Kaohsiung completely dominated the industry. In many of those years, it scrapped more tonnage than the rest of the world put together. So a couple of hundred big ships a year. And as with many industries, Taiwan followed in Japan's footsteps. So when shipbreaking declined in Japan in the late 1960s, the baton passed to Kaohsiung.
And it's quite fitting, actually. Taiwan's ship scrapping industry started just after World War II with the salvage of wrecked vessels in Kaohsiung port. Back then, there were over 100 small ships and about 10 big ones.
Must have been a hell of a sight, eh? Rows of old passenger liners and warships, tankers, towering cranes, workers swarming over the ships with their cutting torches. And I found some wages in a 1973 article. Torch operator earned $4.50, crane operator $3 to $4, and a laborer $1 to $2 a day.
Okay, so anywhere from $4.50 a day to just $1 a day. That's not that much considering the dangers involved with those particular jobs, but those wages would go up quickly and make the industry unsustainable in Taiwan.
Yes, it wasn't just higher labor costs, though. Safety and environmental regulations would also hurt profits. Shipwrecking in Kaohsiung came to a sudden end around 1989. The industry moved to China and South Asia, that is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh.
There was actually an accident that put the nail in the coffin of that industry in 1986, August 11th. So it's 11:40 in the morning and the city's rocked by this huge explosion. Areas near the port are showered with pieces of metal, burning globs of oil. Thousands of windows were broken from the explosion, and there was this massive fire that took them 2 days to put out. So that accident resulted in 16 deaths and about 100 injuries. And what had happened was there had been an explosion on an oil tanker at a shipbreaking wharf.
Oil tankers were quite common there at that time. Some damaged in the Iran-Iraq war, they'd be towed into harbor with crude oil still in the holds, and that cargo could be pumped out and sold off.
Right, illegally, of course.
Gray area, yes.
I see. But that deadly accident focused attention on safety in the shipbreaking industry, and authorities decided to relocate the shipbreaking wharf from the main Kaohsiung port. And in 1989, that area was replaced by a container center.
Yeah, the industry was in a worldwide recession, and the shipwreckers decided not to relocate elsewhere in Kaohsiung. The writing was on the wall, and a few years later, shipwrecking was prohibited.
Right. So when you talk to Taiwanese of a certain age, they will often talk about the glory days of economic growth, and they'll tell you about the Big 10 construction projects. So these were massive infrastructure projects in the 1970s. Some of these were transport projects like...
You had the North-South Freeway, electrification of the West Coast Railway Line, Chiang Kai-shek International Airport, now known as Taoyuan International Airport, and Taichung Port.
And it's maybe arguable that Kaohsiung benefited the most. On top of those road and rail links, we got a shipbuilding yard, a steel mill, and an oil refinery / industrial park, the CPC complex, we call it today. So how big a part of Taiwan's economic miracle were these famous 10 big construction projects?
Not as much as you'd expect. They came at the end of the miracle years. They helped from the 80s onward. The government had no Midas touch either. Some of these were failures. Shipbuilding in Kaohsiung, a nuclear power station was very expensive, undertaken mostly as cover for a secret nuclear weapons program.
And that's another story we're going to tell at some point. But overall, I guess we can say the government did a good job of providing stability. And that's easy when there's just, a one-party state, one government in charge. And they also did a good job controlling inflation.
Yes. If you're looking for a success story of government-directed industrialization during the economic miracle, then the best example is the Kaohsiung Export Processing Zone. It was the first in Asia and one of the very first in the world. There were American companies with manufacturing plants there making televisions, and there were Japanese firms, Hong Kong firms.
Right. So these would be joint ventures, smaller, diverse, different businesses. And for these kind of businesses, the Kaohsiung Economic Zone is very attractive because we got cheap labor, no union trouble, right? And a good workforce. We're talking literate, hardworking people here. And the government's offering them cheap land, cheap power, cheap water. And that zone was not subject to the high tariffs in the rest of the economy. You could bring in raw materials cheaply, and they offered tax exemptions for the first 5 years. Companies were also allowed to move profit and capital out of the country.
Almost seems too generous to the foreign companies.
Oh, yeah, but Taiwan got a lot of technology transfer and training from it, and the contacts to the suppliers and retailers. So it worked out for Taiwan really well. The export zones drove things in the early days, but then the little guys took over elsewhere. I've got a typical example here, Da Yang Sporting Goods. So this was a small company making baseballs and footballs, and it starts with a Taiwanese working at that Kaohsiung export processing zone for a Japanese firm. Then after a couple of years, he starts his own company on a family plot of land in backwater Kaohsiung somewhere. He's supplying the Japanese company, and then he moves into supplying American companies. And then finally, production, as we noted, will move to China.
Yep. Yeah, the miracle is based on small Taiwanese businesses, often starting as a family factory on a farm.
And it's interesting, as Taiwan developed, it defied economies of scale. In theory and practice, over time, there's a consolidation, a concentration, right, as the industry matures, and that results in fewer but bigger companies. And in those golden years, well, they were kind of dirty golden years, but still golden, 1965 to 1985, the number of small and medium-sized companies increased almost in proportion to economic growth.
I raise my glass to these Taiwanese small factory operators. They were brilliant. No family history in manufacturing. Sons of farmers.
Some not even that. Sons of landless farm laborers.
Yeah, they were making products they had little or no knowledge of. A foreign customer would hand them or send them a sample. And can you make this? What price? So they had to reverse engineer to copy whatever product they were given, make a prototype, then earn an order. So they perfected the contract manufacturing model. They were very responsive, unpretentious. They understood that the buyer they needed to make money, and they focused on repeat customers. They produced good quality, low cost, and quickly.
You said quality, but back then Taiwan had a bit of a reputation for producing poorly made goods. I mean, even movies like Armageddon had a bit where something didn't work and the guy looks at the back and says "Made in Taiwan." It was a punchline for a while, a bit like China today, no?
Yeah, it's a bit of a pet peeve I have. They could and they can make something as well as the buyer demands. Buyers squeeze them on already thin profit margins. It's largely the buyer's fault demanding super cheap prices.
That is a very valid point. Another interesting thing about those decades was that I guess we could call it a culture of entrepreneurship, wanting to make money. There was a kind of optimism, right? A belief that with hard work and luck, you could make a fortune. There was, what's that phrase? Economic mobility.
Yes, there was a lot of growth. Wages were going up. But if you want to get rich, of course, you're going to have to be an employer rather than an employee.
Right. So pretty much everyone wanted to be a boss of their own little company. And as the Chinese saying goes, better to be the head of a chicken than the tail of an ox, right? I remember a joke from the 80s when something like, throw a rock out of a window and the odds are pretty high you'll hit the general manager or the president of a Taiwanese company. So there were a lot of entrepreneurs. But in the late 1980s, our miracle comes to an end. We mentioned earlier how the Mattel factory for Barbie closed in 1987, leaving for cheap labor, and also the shipbreaking industry in Kaohsiung, right, dies a couple of years later. These are victims of Taiwan's success, higher wages, and also demands for stricter laws for the environment, for safety.
Yes, there was another major factor too, now much forgotten. Eryk, have you ever heard of the Plaza Accord, the Plaza Accord of 1985?
Well, it has the word accord in it, so I'm going to assume it's some sort of agreement.
Yep, an agreement regarding currencies and named after the hotel, the Plaza Hotel in New York, where it was signed. It's obscure economic history, yet it shook up East Asia and the world. The Americans at the time were worried about the growing trade deficit and their overly strong dollar. They pushed other major economies to pull economic levers to devalue currencies. This was targeted mainly at Japan, but also the UK, West Germany, and France.
But not Taiwan?
It came under pressure in 87 and was affected anyway. So from 1985 to 1990, the NT dollar appreciated against the US dollar by over 40%, from 40 NT dollars to 25.5.
From 40 to 25.5 over a period of roughly 5 years. Imagine if you were an exporter. That's just crushing, right? So wages are already high. And then in that same period, martial law in Taiwan finally ends and Taiwanese can go visit China. And what do they see when they visit China? They see a huge pool of cheap labor. And so the exodus of low-end manufacturing from Taiwan to China gets ready to take off and then just rockets away.
And yet, Taiwan continued to grow and prosper. Economic miracle part 2, yeah? In a word, computers. Taiwan became the world's top computer manufacturer, though under foreign brand names.
Yeah, and so how did Taiwan's industry manage to switch from Barbie dolls and Christmas lights and bicycles and shipbreaking to computers?
Government initiatives, private companies, also foreign companies coming to Taiwan, and the Taiwanese people coming back after working and studying in the US. That was huge. There were huge numbers of Taiwanese students there, graduate students too. They're learning useful things, science, engineering, none of this gender studies, post-colonial studies rubbish.
Yeah. So I remember reading somewhere that in the mid-1980s, the Taiwanese were the single largest group of foreign students in US universities. So that's more than from China, India, or anywhere else in the world.
Stunning, yeah. For the transition to computers, we can go back to the Kaohsiung Export Processing Zone established in 1966. So Kaohsiung became the prime location in Asia for big American electronics firms.
But it wasn't only Americans, right?
Also Japanese, and there was a European multinational, Philips. They put their first Taiwan factory there.
Philips is a company based in the Netherlands. So 3 centuries after the Dutch had been ruling parts of Taiwan, they're back.
This export processing zone turned out millions of television sets each year, calculators. And moving forward, we see VCRs, Walkmans, and arcade games. In the 80s.
Okay. I'm seeing the pathway. So the transition to computers from simpler products makes sense if you're making electronics. So if you were making TVs and then you had to switch to monitors for computers, right? It makes sense. It's an obvious match.
Yes, and the Kaohsiung export zone changed over time from foreign to Taiwanese firms. And Taiwanese firms elsewhere were making computers too. Contract manufacturing for computer companies overseas.
If we want to tell the entire computer story and the semiconductor story, we'd have to head north to Hsinchu, the Hsinchu Science Park, home to TSMC, which is the world's biggest chip manufacturer, founded in 1987. But that's a huge story and a story for another podcast. So there we have it, a brief look at Taiwan's economic history. And John is remaining adamant that the economic miracle of Taiwan was indeed a miracle.
Absolutely. I mean, the miracle years were ugly, and they left an ugly legacy of architecture and what have you. Compare that with the beautiful Japanese colonial era buildings and infrastructure.
Right.
That can skew your perspective. Consider Japanese era Taiwan from a manufacturing perspective. What were they making? They only had one important non-agricultural export I know of, and that was very low tech indeed. The Panama hat.
The Panama hat? You're talking about that light straw hat thing associated with the tropics and the seaside, popular with men back in the first half of the 20th century? That Panama hat?
That's the one. Taiwan had its own take on the Panama hat, using a different material from the fiber from a local palm-like tree and undercutting South American producers. Taiwan's hat industry was really big, but this was handcraft, labor-intensive, not by machines, woven by women making a pittance. And it was especially strong in the Taichung, Hsinchu areas. Hats were in the top 5 exports in the 30s. So after sugar and rice, of course, but yeah, up there. In 1931, nearly 15 million hats were produced, and the US was the primary market, and the bestseller was the Panama hat.
So from hand weaving Panama hats to computer chips, that's quite a journey. And we only really touched lightly on aspects of Taiwan's economic miracle, as there's just too much to cover. And speaking of things to cover related to Taiwan, if you have a suggestion of something you'd like us to investigate and talk about in a future podcast, get a hold of us.
I don't use social media, but you can email Formosa Files and Eryk will pass things on to me.
Yes, that's formosafiles@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening to Formosa Files. I'm Eryk Michael Smith.
I'm John Ross. Bye.
Catch you next time.